Hi there, welcome back to my channel. My name is Karis Simone, and what is going to be part 3 of a 3-part series in which I show just how I do my digital art in firealpaca, some processes I go through, as well as giving a little bit of tips as to how I get the final project with all of my pieces. So this video is going to be the end, but if you happen to have missed out on parts 1 and 2 and you're wondering just how I got here, those links can be found in my bio. Without further ado, enjoy the video. So, as you can see, there's been a little bit of a time skip from where I left off in part 2, and that's because I basically went in and finished the rest of the coloring. I figured that since a lot of it is the same process that I covered in part 2, this wouldn't really be anything new. But starting with how I go into effects and the finishing parts of a drawing, the first thing I did after finishing all of the coloring layer, all of the line art, is I started to add these white highlights. Typically, I like to do that in a way that isn't necessarily the most accurate when it comes to lighting, but really more so where I feel like it would bring a nice framing to the piece. So as you can see, I go in on the sleeves, and then later down the line around the face and hair and the arms, and really just trying to add like another dimension of highlight, which is the first step that I do in finishing. For this next effect that I was planning on using, I went ahead and darkened my canvas because what I was going for here was like a glow, and more often than not when I'm aiming for that effect, I like to have a darker background so that the glows and the brighter colors that I'm using to create that image of a glow can really pop out more against the darker background. So it's kind of like a light in the dark is the image that you're getting, or the effect that you're getting by darkening the background. So I go in with a darker gray color, not quite black because black would be a little too harsh, or at least that's what I find most of the times, but something dark enough to where all of the colors are now going to stand out. And so what I do now is I go in and I merge all the layers. At this point, they're all done. I'm pretty much satisfied with them, and any little tweaks that I do along the way can be done to one primary layer. So I merge them all, and I've got one singular thing. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow me to make copies of the layer and apply certain effects to each copy. So for example, I go in there and I make a copy of the layer, and then I change the opacity, and I make this layer a multiply effect. And what that does is it takes all the same color values of what I'd already done and then applies an effect that's going to apply to all of the colors that I already have. So it's a very simple way to make sure that your effects correspond with the image and that they stay in the lines of your image without getting too out of the box or having to completely like draw on top of an image from scratch. My go-tos are usually the overlay filter. I typically like to do that because it makes the colors a little brighter, a little bit more vibrant, and then I turn down the opacity because I don't want it to be too much. But even with that little bit, you can see just how much it's already changed the colors and made the image look more cohesive as a whole. On top of that, I'll do a multiply or a darken or an overlay layer, one of the three I mean, and it depends on the image. And what I'll do is I'll go into filter and I'll apply a Gaussian blur effect, and you can see now that I've done that as well. I do that on the layer and I do that on the color layer, and what it does is it gives like this hazy blend effect to everything, so it's still doing the bright vibrant addition like the previous layer with overlay filter. It's still doing that, but then what I'm doing with the Gaussian blur is it's kind of blurring out the filter itself, and in the edges of where it's blurred, it's kind of like fading into the background a little bit. I like to think it's a cool effect, and I don't really know when I found out about this effect. It's just something I played around with until I found something that looked cool and figured, oh yeah, I could do this more often with my art because it really blends everything together makes it look like all one big finished piece for sure. No matter what colors you're using, no matter what the character is, if it's just a head shot or if it's shoulders, like this one, or if it's a full body, I do this with every single piece. These effects and these little alterations are something that stay consistent with my style, because I find that no matter what I'm drawing, no matter what I'm portraying, they bring everything together at the end and make it look like more of a finished digital piece. So as I'm doing things, I'll merge layers if I can, because once I have a finished product, I like to keep it as few layers as possible, which is a stark contrast to when I'm actually drawing the pieces. I have a ton of layers going. And now this effect is when I gray everything out. And so the reason I do this is to make my glow effect pop out more. And you'll see as well, like the way that this works, it's all really to make sure that the things that pop on top after this gray are even brighter in comparison. So it might seem like counterproductive to go through and brighten everything than to just go back and dull it out, but it'll make sense in the end. So at this point I decided that the part of the image I wanted to glow the most was the flowers, as if they were like flowers that were truly growing and reflecting light on everything else. In order to do this, I went in with an airbrush in a really, really bright color. I chose blue because I figured that would be the most contrast against the dress, but if you ever like go in and you'd create this glow effect with a color, I recommend starting out with something that is super, super bright, super pigmented. And the color picker, for me at least, and the way that I have firealpaca set up, that's going to be the color in the topmost right corner. It's going to be the brightest, it's going to be the most saturated. And then I go in and kind of try and pick areas where light would naturally reflect. If you were holding a bouquet of glowing flowers, like you would see it reflecting on the bottoms of the hair, of the chin and the jaw, of the bottom of the nose, etc. As well as the areas right next to it on the shoulders and right where the flowers are, basically. And I go in, put those all on, and then in the areas where I want it to make it seem like that's like the heart of the glowing, then I'll go in with the straight up white. And that's because it's gonna look more like if you've ever seen like an LED sign, the way that they look like they're glowing more often than not is because there's like a strip of white in the middle where the light's coming from, and then the color is kind of hazing around it. So I aim to create that effect, and at this point it's very rough. It's not too dependent on it being perfect, because I'm going to go and lay these all down as a guideline, and then I'm going to turn the opacity of this layer down to a very low point where you almost can't see it, and then I'm going to build on it again and again and again, and then you're going to create more layers and build more on the effect until it really, really looks like there's depth in the glow. At this point, I'd also decided I wanted to have like a glow behind the character, and so in order to do that and to create that effect, I went in with the color that I wanted to create the glow with, which was in this case was a dark blue, and I completely outlined my character. And I did this with just like a regular pen brush. It doesn't matter too much if it's perfect or anything. You just want it to be pretty heavy in weight. You don't want it to be too light, or else the effect's not going to work really well, at least in my experience. It hasn't, but I like to have heavy pressure, heavy pen pressure if you're using a pen tablet, and try to also be even and consistent with the pressure, and just go around, trace it. Doesn't have to be perfect. And what I end up doing is applying the Gaussian blur effect just to this line filter. And I find the Gaussian blur is very versatile. You can create a wide variety of effects just using that one tool. And it's because it only applies to the singular layer or the singular actual thing you're trying to edit. So if it's just a layer of line work and you apply the blur, it's only going to blur the lines on the layer, which can create some really cool effects on top of images where the rest of it isn't blurred, it's just the lines. In this case, I was doing so, and because the lines were all outlining the image itself, it gave this really nice outlined blur kind of image. And you'll see when I finish here that it adds, again, more depth, more contrast, like makes the character pop out from the background a little bit more. Now, this was a little bit of an odd occurrence for me because I typically only do this when I have drawn an actual background so that my character is standing out from whatever busyness is going on behind them. But I didn't have a background in this image. I really was just drawing the character, so I didn't necessarily need to do this. However, I did want to show for the purpose of this video how I create this effect in other images where I do draw a background, because it is something I do quite commonly. And you know, just because this one doesn't have a background doesn't mean it's not cool to also see how that effect can be done. And even in the case of this one, I think it did actually turn out well enough to where it shocked me a little bit, and I might try doing this effect more often, even on characters and pieces that don't have backgrounds, because typically I'd only do it when there's something it needs to stand out against. But it ended up adding more depth to the character and kind of bringing it out from this more monotonous gray color that I chose as a background. So at this point, I made an effort to go back in and bring the whites back, specifically in the eyes, because that is something I consider a part of my quote-unquote style. So I wanted those to stand out. Typically, you will see the eyes being a true white in my art, and really glowing against whatever the background is. They glow even more in this particular instance because I went through and darkened the actual hues of the image, but usually it'll be a little less standing out than that. It'll just be white. And then I go in again with the white highlights and frame the face, the cheek, the jaw, really bringing again attention to the details of the image that might have been a little bit lost under the more grayish hue that I added earlier. And then, as you can see here, I lighten it up. I actually started to dislike the gray and how much it was actually weighing the colors down, so I made it a little less harsh. And this also served its purpose when I was trying to show exactly how I do the last step of my effects, which is going in with the overlay or the dodge filter, one of those two typically, and another really bright color similar to what I started with, where it's a far top right most saturated color. I go in with an airbrush and I completely cover the image, and this is one of my favorite, most consistent effects, because I just absolutely love what this does to digital art. But basically, if you're in dodge or overlay, more often than not I'll do dodge because dodge is even more intense than overlay. It'll take all the values of your image, saturate them to the color level you have them, and then it'll also kind of apply this luminescence. It'll be a lot lighter, almost as if the content is glowing, which really works for this piece where I'm trying to make it look like it's glowing. But even when you're not going for that specific effect, it creates a very nice wash and makes all the colors look more cohesive than they were before, especially if you've done something like I do and like I typically do, where you pick colors that clash or that are complementary but also really different. Applying this effect at the end will make it all melt like butter together, and then you'll see just how much using those different colors pays off, because it really brings it together to be the final finished piece. And this is me just looking at it, and this is where I decided to finish up with the piece and wrap up, because at that point, usually with my digital art process, using that final effect, it puts the bow on top for me, and there's little to nothing else that I feel needs to be changed. So here is my finished piece, and we've been through the whole process. We've seen how I went ahead and sketched and ideated the character, how I went through and blocked and colored, how I did the line art, down to here and having the colors and then putting down effects to make a finished character. and I quite like the finished product. I feel like it accurately captured just how I go through my digital art process using firealpaca, of course. Once again, a great program that I would recommend others to try, especially if they're beginners in digital art. So, I hope you enjoyed this 3-part series. If you've got any more questions about details that I might have glossed over, or if there's anything else you wish to see gone into with more detail in the video of its own, do not hesitate to let me know in the comments. Be sure to like and subscribe for